I just want to supplement with a couple of comments from the Duke Clergy Health Initiative at Duke Divinity School. I've had the privilege of being a researcher and consultant to that project. So I want to do that, and I maybe forgot to mention this is the feel-good session of the day. Are you feeling that? It's pretty exciting statistics. The one thing I would want to mention is that much of what we see here, and this is not just United Methodist clergy, by the way, can be prevented by some fairly basic things. Some research suggests the average pastor in America across denominations exercises once a month, which is probably not going to get it done, right? So we have this combination of high demand in certain ways, low control in certain ways, high effort in certain ways, low reward in certain ways, a high degree of what some occupational psychologists call emotional labor, meaning the constant interpersonal stressors that pastors are immersed in. Role immersion is another concept some of you may be familiar with, where you're just constantly immersed in the role, and when do you take a break from that role, as has been mentioned. And one of the things that some of us think might be going on has to do with the physiology of stress, which you would know more about as an MD. But if you know anything about stress, what happens in the body, at 38 at least, stress hormones get released when we're stressed, and they do certain things. They suppress serotonin, which is linked to depression when that gets too low. They suppress the natural tranquilizers in the body, which increases anxiety, suppress our immune system, which leads to other illness. And so when you look at a high stressful job, no exercise or self-care, then you get the kinds of outcomes that we see in terms of the physical and emotional health. But I wanted to just supplement that much of the Duke Clergy Health research is very similar in results to what you just heard. So higher rate of metabolic syndrome than the general population, and not just church people, but we're talking about just anybody out there in American society, and then also higher depression. And if we could switch, do I do that or do you do that back there? Let me see if I can find it here. There we go. So the depression rates in the Duke study, do I have to hit something else to bring those up? Sorry about that. You'll see this in just a second, that the rate of depression is higher than what was found in the denominational study. Just a couple caveats about that. The Duke study, the stipulation of the grant that was given was that the study include the United Methodist pastors in North Carolina. So just North Carolina Methodist pastors are in this study. It's a higher rate of depression. There's also a much higher response rate in the Duke study than the denominational study. That could account for some of that. In fact, one of the funny stories we like to tell is because the grant was so large, we were able to send out a $10 Starbucks card to all of the pastors who filled out the survey. So just fill it out or not. Either way, you have a stressful job, so enjoy some coffee. And we think that the guilt of getting that Starbucks card motivated a lot of pastors to participate in the study. But very high response rates. So in other words, it's likely that pastors who are depressed did not self-select out of participating in the research, which sometimes can happen when there's a lower response rate. But similar kind of finding where the rate of depression is about twice as high as the norm population. And so again, a lot of the symptoms of depression that are involved in that are more the physiological symptoms around energy and physical, just feeling like I'm motivated and can get out of bed, those kinds of things. We also took it a step further, both to look at are there populations by gender or age that are particularly at risk for depression. So men appear to be more depressed than women among North Carolina clergy. Another caveat to that, however, is some of the recent thinking on depression, some of you may know, is that the way we've traditionally diagnosed depression is maybe more male depression, or pardon me, more female depression, traditionally the way we've diagnosed it. And the distinction being, more often than not, women tend to feel their depression, men tend to act out their depression. Because men are often socialized, depending on cultural background, to not be in touch with feelings and so forth. And so sometimes when you are talking with a male pastor or a man in therapy, they may not be aware of feeling depressed, but if you look at their behavior, there's addictive behavior, there's a lot of anger issues, those kinds of things. And what's really going on is an underlying depression of some kind. And so there's some gender differences as far as that goes. But we also wanted to know what not just the correlations, which is what we saw in the earlier study. In other words, what factors are related to depression, but in a hierarchical regression model, what actually predicts depression. So these are the things that if there are more of these, then there is more higher rate of depression for United Methodist pastors. So the unhealthier you are, the more depressed you are, sort of makes sense, and that's a chicken and egg sort of question in some ways. But feeling more socially isolated, more depressed, people in the congregation are critical of the pastor more often, more depressed, financial stress more depressed, and doubting my call more often also significantly contributes to feeling more depressed. So and by the way, there's a great website for the Clergy Health Initiative. You can log on, and there are, 8 or 10 or so journal articles that have been published so far and more on the way. The one I'm about to talk about next as we end this session is one that's in the works. So these slides will not be on the website for this conference because they're not published yet. So this is like hot off the press sorts of information from the Duke project. But what we wanted to do is broaden out from just depression, look at burnout and anxiety as well. And again, similar kinds of things that predict negative mental health, social isolation, financial stress, congregational demands, meaning excessive, sort of unfair demands, life unpredictability given the 24/7 schedule and itinerancy in some ways, and thoughts of leaving the ministry. But a little bit of a paradigm shift has happened thanks to the lead researcher at Duke, whose name is Regine, and she started to think about the way we conceptualize this whole project and looking at how unhealthy are clergy in terms of mental health. And we typically think of mental health as the absence of positive emotion, poor mental health. But that's sort of necessary but not sufficient to really look at it holistically. So there's also sort of the positive side to that, an abundance of positive emotion. And so we think of mental illness as having either severe mental illness or absence of mental illness. And so what we want to try to do is think about both sides of this. Like what predicts both the presence of mental illness, if you want to look at it that way, depression and anxiety and so forth, and what predicts the presence of positive emotions. So we're sort of catching the whole picture there. Let's get my animation here. So these are the things that predicted positive clergy mental health. So we've been looking at what predicts negative. But if a congregation is more supportive, then there's much more satisfaction and quality of life and personal accomplishment in terms of avoiding burnout for pastors, feeling the congregation is relatively healthy and responsive to the suggestions, the leadership of the pastor, feeling the presence of God in daily life and ministry, being pleased with their last appointment change, and feeling like supervisors will consider their gifts in placement. So again, it's sort of that more collaborative appointment process tends to contribute to positive mental health. Regine acquainted me with this study. Some of you may be familiar with this. Apparently, I think this was at Harvard. Yeah, a Harvard study that they followed people literally their entire lifespan. It's the most comprehensive longitudinal study of human development ever done. And basically the bottom line was that having intimate relationships and social support makes all the difference. Across all kinds of physical and mental health outcomes, across all kinds of people, that relationships are absolutely key to well-being. And so what's really fascinating about this most recent journal article where we're looking at both the negative health outcomes and the positive health outcomes, various factors contribute and predict aspects of both negative and positive mental health, but the crux of the whole thing seems to revolve around three things primarily as the largest factors that contribute either way to things being really positive for pastors or things being more on the negative end. And those three things are social support, social isolation, and financial stress, interestingly. So in other words, the more social support a pastor feels, the less isolated they feel and the less stress they have, then that really tips the scale in a major way toward positive mental health, and the opposite direction. If pastors don't have social support from their congregation and their family and folks outside the congregation, if they're really socially isolated, which pastors often are and in some ways contribute to that ourselves, even though it's a psychologically isolating role, and have more financial stress, then that really tips the scale the direction of the negative health outcomes that we're finding. So just a couple of thoughts about what are some of the implications of this? And then we'll take a couple of questions and have our break. Some of the kinds of clinical implications for the clinicians in the room, both in doing assessments, and let me mention this as well. We're going to get to more about sort of the so what of all this information for the purposes of assessment, by the way. So when we get to talking about behavioral health guidelines a little bit later and using those as an assessment tool, then this will begin to click a bit more as to why did we feel this was important to share with you what research is bearing out in terms of what are the stresses that are inherent within pastoral ministry, what are the outcomes we're seeing in pastors, what can we do on the front end to assess for risk factors, as well as sort of help people be aware going into this profession of these risk factors, and how can you help take care of yourself to prevent some of these outcomes that we're finding. So some clinical implications to decrease the mental health stigma around depression in particular, sort of normalize it, normalize the high demands and feelings of inadequacy that often accompany pastoral ministry. The job is so complex, as we're going to hear about later with the KSAPs. It's just really impossible for a pastor to feel competent in every single area it'd be nice to be competent in as a pastor. And it's a sort of a setup to feel shame on some level, and so we have to sort of think carefully about that. Boundaries, conflict, assertiveness training seem to be key, relaxation training in various ways, including day off. Classic example of this that I often share with pastors in doing seminars around these kinds of things. Many of you have been in pastoral ministry, even some of the clinicians in the room, and may have experienced kind of the Monday blues that pastors talk about. Anybody ever experienced that? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. What more likely than not is happening after that 16, 18-hour day on Sunday, I think spending stress hormones like crazy, adrenaline being the primary one, which is essentially what we do for ourselves when we drink caffeine. We sort of stimulate our adrenaline. Cortisol is another one, which is tied to appetite and what creates plaque in your arteries. And again, it starts to make sense, the health findings we are finding when you think about the physiology of stress. But what's likely happening on Monday is a transient post-adrenaline depression. In other words, your body has to recover. And it's when pastors feel kind of foggy, can't think clearly, a little fatigued, not at your best. And pastors will often take that day off, right, to sort of recover. And so what I recommend to pastors is actually don't take that day off. Go into the church, shuffle some papers around in your desk, do some low-stress kinds of things if you can. The church created the stress so they can have you on your worst day of the week, right? Can I get an amen about that? And then take a day off later in the week. We can actually enjoy the kinds of activities that bring renewal and refreshment. Try that for a month or two and see what kind of difference that can make, and it's really amazing how that can change some things sometimes. Encourage attention to physical health and social networks, we've heard that. And then institutionally, and again, probably not just for the United Methodist system, but other denominations that are here, helping clergy manage congregational expectations and actually their own internal expectations. Clergy have such a sense of high calling. Often the demands that we place on ourselves are in some ways unrealistic and not fair, which just exacerbates the problem. Encourage financial planning, whether in seminary or at some point in continuing education. That seems to be something coming up a lot. Encourage exercise and attention to physical health. Encourage taking time away. Destigmatizing depression. Support pastors serving particularly unhealthy churches. And that might be a whole nother conversation. How do you identify those churches that seem to be sort of have a pattern of being sort of clergy killer kinds of churches and toxic, when it's extremely helpful? It doesn't matter how healthy of a pastor you put in that setting, without some intervention from the outside of that congregational system, eventually it's just going to be wearing on anybody you would put in there. Increased sensitivity to clergy and itinerancy transitions, and special attention to young and retiring clergy. There seems to be both a job shock on the front end. In other words, wow, this is really different than what I thought it was going to be like even in seminary when I was sort of studying it academically, but now that I'm actually out there doing it day in and day out, holy cow, this is way different than I thought it was going to be. And so on the front end with young clergy, it's difficult. On the retirement end, if you think about that role immersion piece, what happens for pastors is, being a pastor is not something you do, it's something you are, right? So it's not as if you punch out at 5 o'clock and go home. That role immersion happens. And so what happens at retirement how do you stop being what you are? When the role goes away, so to speak. There's a role deprivation that can contribute to depression on the other end. And so was talking with some Salvation Army friends that are here, and they're using a lot of their retired Salvation Army officers to mentor young clergy, and it's giving a meaningful, purposeful role to retired Salvation Army pastors. And there may be something similar in the United Methodist system, but there might be some ways of helping with that by finding meaningful places of service even for retired clergy. I think, and I'll just end with a story, then we can have questions. I work with an African-American woman at APU who was married to a pastor who passed away from cancer recently. And he was in hospice for the last probably year or so of his life. And she went in to visit him one day, and she couldn't find him in his room. And sort of concerned, where might he be? And he was fighting very aggressive cancer at the end of his life and hooked up to IVs and everything that happens when you have one of those sorts of conditions. And she went to the nursing station to ask, and they said, oh, he's down the hall in room such and such. And so she went down there and peeked in, and he was praying with another patient. And she found out that some of the other patients and even the nursing staff found out there was a pastor in the building. And so literally to the day he passed away, he was pastoring the other patients and the nurses and doctors in this hospice facility. And I don't know about you, but that's how I want to end my journey. And so what we want to encourage you to think about, and we'll get there. Greg Hinkle is going to come back later on after Matt Bloom presents after the break here to kind of talk about the so what of this in terms of how do we encourage and do assessment well on the front end so that we can help people avoid the kinds of numbers that are costly from a stewardship perspective, and we want to think well about that. So thanks for your attention. We're going to take another break here in just a second, but a couple of questions about the clergy health stuff that you've heard this afternoon. Anybody? No questions. Wow. I feel like we should all go for a run right now or something, like a group run.